Hi, I'm Scott Motes. I work for the Nature Conservancy, and my responsibility is land management in northwest Iowa. We're here at Silver Lake Fen today, which is a unique geological formation caused where groundwater is forced to the surface by pressure and expelled out through a loose substrate like gravel substrate that we find here. The fens are unique because they're fed by groundwater and also because they're alkaline in nature. And so by having that alkaline in nature, there's a certain array of plant communities that exist here, which are rare in the state. And so here at Silver Lake Fen, it's one of our best examples of a northwest Iowa calcareous fen. Now we're currently standing on basically a floating mat of vegetation over this water that's expelled or forced to the surface. And so it's spongy. It's much like walking on a waterbed. So this plant community that we're standing on is very rare. It's filled with sedges and some typical wetland plants as well. The unique characteristics of these calcareous fens is that they have distinct vegetational zones. And so we have a discharge zone or discharge cone where the water is forced to the surface, which has a unique plant community associated with it. And right next to the discharge zone is a sedge mat zone, which is filled with small and short-statured sedges that are very rare and indicative of a high-quality fen like we have here. Adjacent to that sedge mat zone, we have what we call the adjacent zone, or basically a zone filled with more common wetland species of plants. One of the most interesting things to me about the calcareous fens is the change of vegetation. As you can see, we have a distinct change from the discharge cone, which is taller vegetation, to the sedge mat zone. I don't think there's any other native community in Iowa or natural community in Iowa where those vegetation changes are so abrupt and distinct. And so you can see the discharge cone is characterized by a lot taller plants, higher nutrient content coming out of the water versus a more nutrient deficient environment in the sedge mat zone. I mentioned earlier that the vegetation that you walk on the fens is basically a floating mat of vegetation on water that's forced to the surface by hydrostatic pressure. So you wouldn't expect to find rocks on calcareous fens. What I'm holding in my hand right now is what we call tufa, which is a calcareous precipitate rock. It's a very grainy, soft rock that's easily broken, but it's the only rock that you'll find on the calcareous fens. Roughly 12,000 years ago, the last advance of the Wisconsin Glacier came into this area and deposited a gravel substrate. This is a fairly loose substrate, so we're standing on Silver Lake Fen here, and we have a couple of different geological processes in place here. Number one is the glacial impact, which 100,000 years ago deposited a layer of blue clay, which is an impervious layer. On top of that, this last glacial advance deposited this gravel substrate, which is a loose, porous substrate. So a calcareous fen that we're standing on now is much like an artesian peat spring, where water is forced up from the groundwater up through cracks by hydrostatic pressure to through the impervious layer to a porous substrate like this gravel lens here, and it's discharged out of the side of the hill. So most of our calcareous fens in northwest Iowa are associated with hillsides and often described as hillside seeps. And so as this water comes out through the calcium, it's alkaline in nature, which also means that there's only a certain group of species of plants that can survive on this layer. The vegetation that we're standing on is actually an accumulation of peat, and this accumulation has occurred here for thousands of years at the rate of about 1 millimeter a year, I believe. And so this is formed under anaerobic conditions, which means that it doesn't decompose, and so there's no oxygen in the system, so the peat continues to develop year after year.